Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on Patristics, the Fathers of the Church, History of Christian Antiquity. Picking up where we left off last time, we covered the establishment of the Roman Republic in the year 509 BC, and the Republic continued to exist until 27 BC. Meanwhile, Greek philosophy continued to develop, which introduces us to Heraclitus of Ephesus, who lived from 535 to 470 BC. He was another Ionian Greek. Ephesus is one of the Ionian colonies on the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, the western coast of present-day Turkey, and the same Ephesus that St. Paul would later visit, and to which he addressed the New Testament letter to the Ephesians. Centuries later, because Heraclitus lived 5 centuries earlier. He was in continuity with the pre-Socratic philosophers we started covering last time, those who sought to supplant by filling the gaps within Greek religion in terms of morality and understanding the nature of the universe. So he argued, he differed with Thales of Miletus, who we previously covered, and Thales believed that the common denominator, the initiating principle of the universe was water. Heraclitus disagreed. He also differed from Pythagoras, who argued that the governing principle, the underlying dynamic of the universe, was order that could be understood through mathematics. Heraclitus went in the completely opposite direction. He argued that the underlying dynamic of creation of the universe is the process of change. All of reality is in continual flux without stability. So he's the one, if you've ever heard of him, he says you never stand in the same river twice, because it's constantly moving. The water's constantly moving. Overlapping with his life toward the end, but a younger man, was Democritus, who lived from 460 to 370 BC, but elsewhere. He lived in a different Greek colony, the colony of Abdera. That's in the northwest Aegean. So it was not an Ionian. It was not part of Ionia. It was a Greek colony, but it was not in the same area as Ionia. He approached the philosophical problem of explaining reality in another way. His approach, you may, in your physical science classes in elementary or high school, you may have had a teacher who did the same approach. Let's see. Would be how. So it would start with a question: How many times can you cut this in half? So you cut it. It's 12 inches. So you cut it at the 6-inch mark. Then you cut that at the 3-inch mark. Then you cut that. But how can that process? How many times can you do it? Can you just continually cut the smaller pieces in half and half and half and half? Is that an infinite possibility, or is there a limited number of times you can do that? Now, obviously, he had instrumental limitations, no microscopes. So he theorized. He pronounced that any piece of matter was divisible only a limited number of times. It was finite, not infinite. Once you got to the smallest once you got down to the smallest part that cannot be cut, cannot be divided anymore, he gave that particle the Greek word for unbreakable, which is atomos, from which we get the word atom. Now, of course, we know that the atom has been split. In the modern period, of course, he didn't know that was possible. And when we do split the atom, of course, it's a big deal to do that. So, but anyway, in the atomos, it's unbreakable. It's the smallest piece of matter. So with that proposition, he then extrapolated that all of the physical universe, but which including us, human beings, are nothing more than a temporary aggregation of these particles of matter, of these atoms. And when we die, or when a tree or animal or anything that dies, then those particles dissipate. Now they don't disappear forever. They don't disappear because they're unbreakable, but they reconstitute into something else. So the particles, the atoms, the atomi that make up the human person, the human being, when that person dies, then the physical aspect decomposes, but the atoms continue to exist. Now they might come together, in his view, to create the physical form, or the physical matter of another person, or something else entirely. So in this view, now you remember that the twofold project of the pre-Socratic philosophy is to understand the physical world, but also to a morality. How do we conduct ourselves in this physical world? So with this view of the human person, then there's no need for a supernatural reality, and there is no purpose to existence. There's no higher purpose to existence. So we're just a temporary, accidental aggregation of these particles that will dissipate and then reconstitute as something else. So that there's no purpose to existence apart from the fact of this unfolding physical process. So that, obviously there's no morality to be based on that. Then it just, nothing we do matters. Now, the next step was taken by another philosopher whose life overlapped his partially, and from the same city of Abdera. If there's no purpose to existence, to human existence, outside of this unfolding process, then the next step, but yet we still exist. I mean, that we do still have a time on Earth. So he was not proposing, Democritus was not proposing that, okay, there's no higher purpose, therefore we should all just kill ourselves. He was not proposing that. So the next guy in our list is Protagoras, Protagoras, lived from 485 to 410 BC. Protagoras took the next step, and he coined the phrase, or at least it's attributed to him, the phrase that later became the motto of secular humanism, that man is the measure of all things. So with this motto, Protagoras was the father of a movement within Greek philosophy called sophistry. Sophistry, taking its name from the Greek word for wisdom, sophistry. So the same root as philosophy. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, but sophistry is just the word for wisdom. Now it's a sarcastic application. Sophists were itinerant teachers of ways, methods to use language, reasoning, and modes of behavior in order to achieve success in the world. So a favorite entertainment in the agora of many Greek cities, the open space, the forum of the Greek cities, where these guys would be to challenge a sophist to defend a particular position. So he'd say, "Sir, I declare that an olive tree is a plant," and then the sophist would give very erudite arguments on the matter, and then he goes, "This is a game." They all knew. So, well, then, sir, well, now I declare that an olive tree is an animal. And then you listen to an equally adroit explanation for that. So it was the process of argument and verbalization and convincing people that was the end. Not see that's why the sophistry, calling them that, it's a sarcastic thing, because they weren't really seeking wisdom, but they used the tools as an end in itself. So, in other words, to put it another way, it didn't matter. It did not matter to the sophist what the olive tree was, whether it was an animal, a plant, a rock, or anything. And nor to the people listening to him. They didn't really care either. It was the entertainment of listening, like an intellectual entertainment, just listening to how this guy would say, well, okay, that is a persuasive argument that an olive tree is an animal. And then he follows, then he made a very persuasive argument that an olive tree is a fish, and going, so is this going on like that? So it's not genuine philosophy. It's not genuine love of wisdom. It's a love of exercising the human faculties of speech and I hate to say reasoning, but at least to make a sequential argument, however stupid it might be. Since the foundation of sophistry was that the individual is the measure of all things, the sophist remained trapped within a box of subjective relativism, in which there is no way to determine absolute truth. As a result, the sophist movement produced many contradictory points of view, much as its modern revival of secular humanism. So again, without reference to a higher purpose, a higher power, or an objective reality, as some of the other philosophers we're going to cover, then how do you finally decide? Now the example I used, that was just a game. What is an olive tree? Is it a plant, an animal? Okay, that really doesn't matter what you believe about that. But when it comes to the bigger questions, remember the four big questions, right and wrong, life and death. Well, then it does matter. It should, even for Protagoras and Democritus, who would say, all we are is a temporary aggregation of atoms that dissipate. Well, okay, maybe it's temporary, but we are still here for a time. So how should we conduct ourselves? Right and wrong, life and death. How do we face our life? How do we deal with death? And the question of right and wrong is what goes on in between. Well, for the sophists, they have no. Well, they can offer many arguments, and as part of the game, they could deliberately contradict themselves. But that doesn't really help. That they may be exercising their wits, but it doesn't provide an answer for those who sincerely want to know the answers about right and wrong, life and death. Okay, so we'll leave them there and just following chronology, because since we're covering all three of these, the cultures, the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Roman, we're jumping back and forth because at this point they're still parallel, and we're getting to the point where they intersect, and then that, and all of which will provide the necessary context for the patristic period. So back to the Greeks, in another context, and how and what happens to them. So remember, skillfully deploying their naval technology, along with the Lydian innovation of coined money, we talked about last time, made the Greek colonies stupendously wealthy. Now, being trading enterprises, their citizens encountered dozens and dozens of cultures and the respective pantheons and belief systems of those cultures. And they could not help but notice that they all contradicted each other, which, so therefore none of them are true, or if one of the dozens is true, well, how do we know? And that includes their own. I mean, they saw that about their own religion. So this overexposure led some of the educated Ionians to dismiss the notion of religion altogether, including their own. And so that's the point where we got with Democritus and Protagoras. Now, this was not just a game among intellectuals. The ones whose names we remember are those who had the leisure time, who had the money to have the leisure time to be able to talk about this and write about this. But it did affect all of Greek culture. That lacuna in terms of morality and in terms of existence, the nature of existence, that did affect the rest of Greek culture because they did not have a unified explanation for understanding either of those things. Now we got up to the point of the atomist, where, okay, this is all we are. We're just temporary, things that dissipate, decompose after death, and nothing we do really matters. So given the spread of selfishness and sophistry as a philosophically supported doctrine, and in the absence of a shared ethical system, it is entirely without surprise that the next phase in Greek history was that it turned on itself. It turned inward, turned against itself, and began the process of destroying itself. This process commenced, the self-destruction of classical Greek culture, began with a ruinously destructive 3-decade-long bloodbath. That's generally, for convenience, it's called the Peloponnesian War, although it spread far beyond that peninsula. And it was many conflicts. I mean, you could say it's properly, accurately speaking, it's really multiple wars. But really just say, just the Greek self-destruction. So let's see. Well, this is it's kind of off the map, but so this is Greece here on the mainland, and then right below that's the peninsula, the Peloponnese Peninsula, and that's where the war started. And then it spread from there all over the Aegean. I should also say here, the island of Sicily, and where is it? Yeah, okay. And on Sicily, Syracuse, the city of Syracuse. I'm gonna just keep that in mind and see the proximity to Greece. That's we're gonna visit that again, and that's kind of where it started, or kind of the reason it started. So the trigger for the war. The Peloponnesian War. Okay, it's spelled Peloponnesian from 431 to 404 BC. The trigger was a dispute in the Greek colony of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. Ignited a dispute over that, ignited the rivalry between Sparta, which is on the Peloponnese Peninsula, and Athens, which is on the mainland of Greece. And the conflict was essentially hegemony. I mean, Syracuse was the trigger, but what really it was a contest for hegemony over the Greek world. The Peloponnesian War is often presented because of the life of Pericles and his speeches that have been preserved in the history of the war by Thucydides. It's often presented, as it was presented by Pericles of Athens, as a philosophical fight between the militarism of Sparta against the humanist democracy of Athens. Now, seen in those terms, militarism won decisively, as Athens was crushed, defeated, humiliated, and forced to accept a degrading peace in 404 BC. And as we'll see, that they had to give up their democracy, and the Spartans installed a puppet oligarchy in its place. So we'll get to that. During this horrific conflict, a generation, 30 years it just went on, there were right-thinking individuals in Greece who recognized that there was something far deeper going wrong, that it was not just a political or economic dispute, it was not just a power struggle. The Socratic movement, beginning in Athens, was an attempt to correct the dissipating forces of Greek intellectual and philosophical life by finally solving the problem, articulating a comprehensive view of the world rooted in sound reason upon which an effective morality could be based, a shared morality could find its foundation. Full comprehension of this endeavor can only take place by understanding its original context. So everyone's heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But they're too often, and generally, usually, since philosophy and history are separate disciplines, and because there's so much, you have to read so much to study either one, they are usually treated separately. So the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle they're just considered as philosophers, and that's studied without the context. And the context is essential to understand. The context was more than just Athens, the city-state of Athens. The movement began during the Peloponnesian War, when Greece was self-destructing. So in the middle of a 30-year-long civil war among the Greeks. It began in the capital of one of the principal antagonists, Athens. Those who joined the movement clearly saw that their culture was self-destructing. It was devouring itself because it was bereft of the tools necessary to solve the basic questions of how to exist properly. And therefore, what was worth the sacrifice? Was it really worth the sacrifice? You have to have a shared morality to be able to make those decisions. Okay, so the father of this corrective movement, of the Socratic movement, obviously is Socrates. Socrates of Athens. Lived from around 469. That is a supposition as far as his birth, but his death date is certainly known as 399 BC. Socrates was born in Alpeci, which was outside, today we'd say a suburb. It was outside the walls of Athens, but he was a citizen of Athens. His father was a stonemason. His mother was a midwife, so we consider him working class today. Socrates followed his father's profession. He was a stonemason and a sculptor. His first wife, Myrto, was the daughter of one of his father's friends, Lysimachus. With her, he had 2 sons. After her death, he remarried a person named Xanthippe, who became renowned for her caustic, abrasive disposition. And with her, he had a 3rd son, Lamprocles. Socrates, as a hobby, enjoyed conversing with people among the workshops around the agora, where he worked. He was a stonemason. Now there, he found himself an object of interest, a person of interest among young men who were not yet allowed to enter the agora. They were not yet allowed to participate in political life, in public affairs, but they were interested. They were at that awkward age, when they were old enough to start to understand some things, but did not yet have the experience or the knowledge to use it. So they still had the impulse, and they liked listening to him. So his conversations with them were preserved by some of their number, including Xenophon and most famously Plato. Socrates, and those weren't the only ones. There were many others. But this is not a course of philosophy, so I'm just doing this for historical background. Socrates was an exponent of a very arduous method of questioning and examining assumptions, to eliminating one uncertainty after another, until all that remained was a proper sequence of thought, and that enabled right action in the world. So reading through the accounts, it can be, frankly, very tedious. Now, for those of you philosophy fans, I don't say that as an insult. I say only that reading, say, one of Plato's dialogues, and just trying to read it cover to cover, and chances are the full content is not going to be accessible from one reading, because it kind of goes all over the place. So, the issue, well, what is the good? Well, okay, and somebody says, well, I think this is good. And then Socrates, well, are you sure about that? Well, what about this? That seems to contradict what you say. And then they argue about that for a while, and then the guy said, well, okay, you're right. All right, well, then that's one uncertainty that's been removed. And then again and again and again. So, from the horizon, from the constellation of maybe 30 issues, they'll go eliminate one after another until there's just one left. And so you do that for one element, then another, and then another, until you have a sequence of thought, a logical sequence. And on that you can base a decision. Now, as with all citizens of the Greek city-states, Socrates was required to perform military service at need. So he served in the army as a hoplite, which is armored infantry, during times of war. He was noted for his valor during battles. He fought in the Peloponnesian Wars in at least 4 battles, and he was noted for his heroism. Also, as a citizen, he had the right to speak publicly on all matters. So the Athenian democracy, before the Spartans destroyed it, was such that anyone who was a citizen, like for laws, all the citizens met and they argued about what law was going to happen, or who was going to get banished, or what they were going to do. So it wasn't like our system where we elect representatives to do that. So he could speak, and he did, and including at trials. So the Athenians also did not have our separation of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, but the assembly of citizens did all of that, the boule, as they call it. That was loosely translated would be parliament, although obviously not with all the political parties and the elected prime minister and all of that we have in the European parliaments today. But it was just the assembly of the citizens. And Socrates earned the enmity of many for publicly opposing some policies of the boule, including during the war. Obviously, Athens lost the war, so there were a number of occasions where battles were lost, and the disadvantage of that kind of system of a direct democracy is that it's easy to get carried away. And so in the emotion, for example, in the emotion of the moment of hearing that they lost a battle, and if the general survived the battle to make it home, then the assembly, could and sometimes did vote to execute the general. Well, Socrates routinely spoke against that, so that's not in accord with right reason. Because the loss of a battle, it might not have been the general's fault. And even if it was, even if the guy made a mistake, well, how is that really, is that good for the longevity of the city-state? To know that any guy who's going out to fight for it knows any mistake, well, then he'll get killed by his own people, if he doesn't get killed by the Spartans. So anyway, he did that. It was like a voice of conscience. Well, that's often is not appreciated by people, especially those who are feeding on emotion and want to do something like that. Oh, yeah, let's kill the general. So this posture, and that's only one example. He did it for a number of issues, but capital punishment is one that he routinely opposed, and not just for that, but for other reasons, as a punishment for other crimes also. This posture as a moral and social critic was seen as dangerously subversive after Athens lost the war, and lost it so badly, in 404 BC. Now, recall I alluded to earlier, among the conditions imposed by Sparta for sparing Athens from complete destruction was that Athens had to accept a puppet government installed in place of their democracy. So that kind of direct participatory democracy was replaced after the war by force by the Spartans, and replaced with an oligarchy, which means ruled by a few. That is remembered in Greek history as the infamous 30 tyrants, led by Athenian collaborators. The corruption and the violence of the 30 was so ghoulish that they were overthrown in 403 BC by a democratic insurgents led by a former triarch, a ship captain, a captain of a trireme. And we talked about what triremes were in previous talks. His name was Thrasybulos. So he rose up. He was a veteran of the war. He rose up against the 30, successfully overthrew them in the name of democracy. But then what? How do you really go from that back to a democracy? You can't. I mean, that's the short answer. You can't. Later, based on observing this, Aristotle and his Politics argued, that once a democracy, once it reaches that point of an oligarchy, there are only two possibilities: either complete collapse into anarchy, or dictatorship. And that could either be ruled by a single dictator or perpetuation of the oligarchy in a dictatorial form. And that's what happened. So he overthrew the 30, that oligarchy, but then it was just replaced by another one, an oligarchy of the 51. Now, it was not quite as nakedly brutal and corrupt as the 30, but it was certainly not democratic, nor was it just. It was that government, the second oligarchy, that brought Socrates to trial in 399 BC. He was accused of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens, and he was accused of impiety. The Greek word asabaia, meaning not believing in the gods of the state. So a subversive. Those are the official charges, but there was a drumhead trial. The decision was a foregone conclusion. What they were really prosecuting is his relentless criticism of them for the anti-democratic trajectory of Athens. As a punishment, he was sentenced to death. Of course, everybody knew that's what was going to happen. But one advantage of an oligarchy is their corruption. Socrates had many friends and admirers, former students, who were willing to employ bribery to facilitate his escape. Now, that would mean he could never return to Athens, but at least he would be alive, and they would be willing to, help support him or set up life somewhere else. But he declined. In part, he probably did not want to expose them to the danger, because while corruption, can be found in any form of government, that does not mean necessarily that every single person is corrupt. And you try to bribe the wrong person, and that could backfire. And that means then they would be exposed too. Or it could have just been something deeper, that he saw what happened. He was born in the democracy. He knew Pericles, he heard the speeches of Pericles. He fought for Athens in the war, and they lost. And then they do this. This is obviously a malignantly unjust abuse of their version of the legal system. And maybe he just, he had enough of it. He was 71, which was by the standards of the day, considering medical care then, was quite old. And maybe he just didn't want to bother. So he preferred suicide. He drank hemlock and committed suicide in 399 BC. The impact of Socrates and his method, the only reason we know anything about him, is he didn't write anything himself. He preferred, his teaching method was the dialogue. But he and his method were given enduring life in the 30 dialogues written by his most famous pupil, Plato of Athens. Plato lived from 429 BC to 347 BC. And it's spelled Plato, Plato. It's not Plato. It's Plato. The philosopher who is remembered by that name, Plato, was actually not named Plato. He was actually named Aristocles. He was from an aristocratic Athenian family, completely different social class from Socrates, who was working class. Plato's father, or I should say Aristocles' father, was named Ariston. He traced his ancestry back to the ancient kings of Athens. And then through them, because the ancient kings of Athens, at least the one Codrus, the one he claimed descent from, then Codrus had claimed to be descended from the sea god Poseidon. So Plato's father, is around the family at the dinner table, and remind everyone, we're descended from Poseidon, and say, and Plato grew up hearing that, and said, yes, Dad, yes, we are descended from Poseidon. Yeah. His mother, Plato's mother, was descended not from Poseidon, but from a person who actually existed, the famous Athenian lawgiver Solon, without whom the Athenian democracy would not exist. So after the Athenians overthrew their democracy, after they overthrew their monarchy in the early 6th century BC, Solon began crafting a new form of government for them that ended up being the Periclean democracy. In addition to Plato, they had 2 sons. So Plato had 2 brothers, in other words, and a daughter. So Plato had a sister, had 2 brothers and a sister. The sister, Petone, had a son whom she gave the unfortunate name of Speusippus. I only mention him because Plato himself never married, never had children. So Speusippus was his heir. And Speusippus ended up taking over the academy, the school that Plato founded, as we will see presently. So as a young man of means, his family had money, so he didn't have to work for a living, unlike Socrates, who did. And Plato, he was born in 429, so he was born during the war, but there's no evidence there's no indication he fought, that it ended before he was old enough to fight in the war. So he grew up after the war, then when Greece was at peace, and Sparta was running things. So the Spartans, if nothing else, they kept the peace. So then travel, and he could travel. He had the money to travel, so he did. He traveled to Italy, to Sicily, then went south to the other side of the Mediterranean, visited North Africa, Cyrenaica, which is now Libya, and Egypt. In Egypt, he came into contact with Jewish monotheism. And so we'll have occasion to visit them again. When he returned, Plato purchased a 370-acre olive plantation 1 mile north of the city of Athens, and in the year 387 BC, set up a school in the grove of Hecademus, who was a mythological figure. The stories in the myth, he was a savior of the city in the pre-Trojan War period. So Plato, the school he opened on the olive plantation, was named in his honor, the Academus. Then the school in the grove of Hecademus became the Academy. Here, in the Academy, Plato taught a philosophical synthesis. Before meeting Socrates, Plato had been instructed by a Heraclitan philosopher named Critolus. And Plato never lost those early lessons, his awareness of the constant change in the physical universe. Trees grow, animals grow, rivers move. It rains, then the water disappears. It's either soaked up in the ground or soaked up by plants. Even rocks, you get broken, or they roll away, or they erode. He never lost his awareness of that. Yet he was also influenced by Pythagoras, whom we are also covered, and the implications of Pythagorean mathematical ordering of the universe. So Pythagorean numbers became the basis for the Platonic forms, or the Platonic ideals, which are objective realities that exist apart from any physical object, and therefore they remain immune to change. That those ideas, those ideals, those forms do not change. So, for example, using a Pythagorean example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, you could, let's see, you might have 4 objects in front of you. So 2 plus 2. So now I have 4 objects in my hand. All right. So these exist in the physical universe. So I can point to these and say 2 plus 2 equals 4. But correlatively, now I don't have anything in my hands. So my arms are folded. But 2 plus 2 is still 4. I don't need to have any physical objects in my hand to know that. 2 plus 2 remains 4. In the same way, Plato regarded the good, the true, the beautiful as objective realities that exist without a particular example. Like, you don't need a particular example. I mean, you can have one, an act of goodness, words of truth, a person of beauty. You can have that in front of you and point to that. Say, yes, that person is beautiful. Those words are true. That act is good. But, likewise, if those were removed from the front of you, then just you can say, yes, such an act is good. Such a declaration is true. Such a person or such a building or such a piece of art or work of art is beautiful. You can say that, we can say that, because in Plato's mind, that just like the numbers, that those exist apart. And so the connection between that Socratic morality and Plato's metaphysics, that which exists beyond the physical, enabled the solution to the moral problem, that it is possible, and in fact is essential for right action in the world, to conform one's behavior to these objective truths. Now, one way we can discern what they are is that there are cases, modes of existence, situations that are always and everywhere beneficial to the human person, such that it is impossible to conceive of the human person being harmed by them. So, for example, clean drinking water, proper nutrition, an environment of physical safety where one is protected from attack, shelter from the weather. It's impossible to conceive of a human person being harmed by those things. And and the reverse is also true. That in the absence of clean drinking water, in the absence of food, in the absence of shelter and protection from attack, in the absence of truth, in the absence of goodness, that it is impossible to conceive of the human person benefiting from such a situation. And that's kind of the Socratic way. You work through each one of those situations. So it's very arduous intellectually, very time-consuming. But that did provide the solution to the problem. As way back as, Thales seems simplistic and, compared to, and it was, but he was the first. Okay, water. Then Pythagoras' order, mathematics. Heraclitus. Okay, everything's just changed. Then Democritus. Oh, it's all just atoms and all. So that you can see the development. That's why covering them chronological order, I think, is helpful. So you can see the development. And I remember, nothing just happens. So they all built on each other, even if they disagreed with the guy who went before. The reading and studying that the guy who went before they disagreed with helped, if by no other reason, to provoke reflection on that with which they instinctively disagreed, in order to formulate a rival sequence of reasoning. Now, the only reason I'm talking about all of this is because this Platonic metaphysics, this Platonic philosophy of that which exists beyond the physical realm, would prove very useful to the early church fathers in explaining the sacraments, as well as morality, based on the connection between the natural order and the supernatural order. The natural order is the physical universe that we live in, but that which is beyond the physical does exist. That is our belief. And in that, the Platonic metaphysics helps, that there really is a goodness, a truth, and a beauty, based on the same reasoning as 2 + 2 is 4, whether or not you have 4 things in front of you or not. And so we can in terms of the philosophy of morality, of ethics, we can say, and the church can make true statements about morality, that this is always and everywhere wrong, or this is always and everywhere right. Yeah. Okay, and so in terms of the sacraments, then the connection between the sacraments are a connection between the supernatural and the natural. So grace is one of those things, like goodness, truth, and beauty, that exist eternally in the mind of God. We have access to that by means of the sacraments because of the Holy Spirit. And that logic is included within the prayers. In the prayers, we always pray, like, for example, at the Mass, there's a point in the Eucharistic prayer, let your Spirit come upon these gifts, that they may become the body and blood of Christ. So it's not, that transubstantiation is not something that we can do individually in the natural order on our own, but we can pray that the Holy Spirit come down and effect that change, which is a miracle. So the grace comes from the supernatural order, but by means of the prayers, which we offer as a privilege granted to us by Jesus at the Last Supper, we pray, let your Spirit come upon these gifts, that they may become the body and blood of Christ. So then that's a change that does occur in the natural order, in the physical universe, and one from which we can benefit, is that's how we access grace, one of the ways we access grace. Okay, Plato died in his sleep after attending a wedding feast in the year 347 BC, at the age of 82, never married or had children. Plato's legacy included preserving the teachings of Socrates in a series of dialogues. The traditional list enumerates 30 dialogues, though the specialists in Plato propose that some of them are actually later works erroneously attributed to Plato. Those questions are beyond, our need to discuss. Mindful that the authorities regarded as a threat the Socratic practice of public disputations in the marketplace and public criticism of government policy, Plato delivered his teachings in this less threatening form. So the dialogues are a literary form, similar to a play. Some more than others, like the Symposium, which is a famous one. I mean, that could actually be acted out as a play. And further, he wasn't teaching this in the agora, in the marketplace. He was teaching it a mile outside of the city on his private estate. So that's how he got to he didn't get arrested and charged, because he did it in that more in that less threatening manner. Among Plato's many pupils, one who is famous that we must speak about spent 20 years at the academy, and that is Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC. Aristotle was not an Athenian. He was born in Stagira in northern Greece, which is 34 miles east of the site of what would be in the New Testament period Thessalonica, where St. Paul addressed the two New Testament letters to the Thessalonians. Now, at the time Aristotle was born, it wasn't there. Alexander the Great had to live, because it's actually named for a half sister of Alexander the Great. So, but anyway, that's where to orient yourself. He was born east of that. His father's name was Nicomachus, who was a physician, to the king of Macedonia, King Amyntas. Aristotle was orphaned at the age of 13, the details of which have not been preserved, but apparently both his mother and father. So may have been some kind of plague or disease. Aristotle was then taken in by Prosenus, who was a family friend, for the next 5 years, until he moved to Athens at the age of 17 to enter Plato's academy. He stayed there for 20 years. He departed after Plato died, because Aristotle did not like the direction that Plato's nephew Speusippus was taking the academy after. Aristotle then traveled for the next 4 years throughout Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands, compiling observations on the natural world that formed the basis for much of his later scientific work. Those 4 years were key, just as the 5 years that Charles Darwin spent on the Beagle doing the same thing. He wrote about that for the rest of his life. He used the observations he made in that time for the rest of his life, and so did Aristotle. In the year 343 BC, he availed himself of his old family connections back in Macedonia to become the tutor to the son of King Philip II of Macedon, the child who grew into Alexander the Great. Along with, he was also tutor to many of the other youth of the aristocracy of Macedon, who later followed Alexander into battle. Aristotle, in this period, once he had stable employment, he married a lady named Pythias, and with her he had one daughter who was named for her mother. Aristotle did not accompany Alexander on his conquest, which we'll talk about shortly. In 335, instead, he returned to Athens. After Athens was conquered by his Macedonian patrons. Aristotle could not own property in Athens because he was not a citizen. So he established his school in a temple to the pagan god Apollo Lycaeus, which was near a gymnasium outside the eastern wall of Athens. He taught at this location for the next 12 years. This was a public structure. He didn't own it. It was a public structure. He wasn't the only one teaching there either. The structure, the Lyceum, as it was called, came to be called because of Apollo Lycaeus, was designed with colonnades that in Greek are called peripatoi. Those are walkways. And Aristotle liked to use those, walking with his students as he was teaching them, as they would, talk about things. So that gave one of the names for his school of philosophy. It could be Aristotelianism, but it's also called the peripatetic philosophy. Those who walk while studying, those who walk while during the lecture. During this period, his second Athenian period, his wife died. After which, reproduction occurred with his slave named Herpylus, bringing into the world a son, whom he named for his father, Nicomachus, and to whom he dedicated the 10 books of his ethics, which still exist, the Nicomachean Ethics. This was the most productive period of his life in terms of scholarship, covering a vast, stunning array of inquiry: science, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, drama, poetry, biology, botany, agriculture, medicine, and probably some more I'm not thinking of. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, there was a wave of anti-Macedonian sentiment spread throughout Greece because the Macedonians had, after all, conquered Greece. And then, as we'll see, that it wasn't just Greece that went to pieces after Alexander died, as a significant portion of the known world did. Remembering the fate of Socrates, and also remembering that he was closely associated with the Macedonians, Aristotle left Athens in 322 BC before some vindictive person could make up false accusations about him. He settled in the city of Chalkis on the island of Euboea, which is it's in the Aegean off the eastern coast of the Greek mainland, and he died there shortly after at the age of 62. There's one story about the way he died, but it's from much later, so I'll just tell you as a story, just with the caveat that who knows. So Euboea, it's a long, narrow island, over 100 miles long, and there's a narrow strait between it, separating it on one side from the Aegean, and from the Greek mainland, and then on the other side, on the eastern side, is the Aegean. So because of the way the water goes through, there was supposed to have been a bay or an inlet where the wave action seemed to be anomalous. Just eyeballing it seemed to be anomalous. It seemed that the waves were going in a direction that they shouldn't. And Aristotle, being Aristotle, he was interested in this. So he assumed that there was something beneath the waters that was diverting it and making it go in a direction it shouldn't. So he went swimming, to figure it out. But at this point, he was 62. Now, of course, he knew how to swim. He grew up knowing how to swim. But he had spent, obviously hadn't kept up with it and overestimated his strength and endurance in the water and was overcome by the waves and drowned at the age of 62, but died in the pursuit of science. Aristotle shared in the Socratic project of seeking certainty by eliminating all the grounds for uncertainty, but he followed a distinct path. Rather than hypothesize the existence of a non-physical, non-spatial, non-temporal realm of abstract forms like Plato did, Aristotle instead preferred to eliminate uncertainty by observation, observing the natural order through experimentation. Subsequently, this evolved into the empirical method. Named for the Greek word empirikos, means experience. So the method of experience, or to put it in more conventional English, to learn by doing. Aristotle had, as I alluded to earlier, as one of his pupils, the future king of Macedon, a man who changed history, and that is no hyperbole. Alexander, well, in Macedonian regnal numbers, he was Alexander III, but he's best known, obviously, as Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BC, he reigned from 336 to 323 BC, and he died in 323, so he didn't even see the age of 40. Throughout his life, and in the aftermath of his death, we find the origins of the cities of Antioch and Alexandria, which will figure prominently in the Patristics period, as well as through Alexander and the aftermath, we find the reason that the New Testament was written in Greek instead of in Hebrew or Aramaic of the Holy Land. The cultural suicide of the Peloponnesian War exhausted the ability of the Greeks to keep what they cherished the most, their freedom. In emergency situations, as the economy collapsed and as the political order collapsed, city-states turned to stratagory, to generals, who demanded absolute power in exchange for protection. Now, one city after another accepted it, because remember how the Peloponnesian War ended. It ended with Sparta victorious, and Sparta was an entirely militarized society. So they figured, okay, the lesson they took from that, well, okay, then that's might makes right. Maybe the military, maybe that is the best way to run, to run the world. But Sparta developed that way over centuries, whereas the other city-states had not. So to try to make themselves Sparta when they didn't have the 300 years of background, of that kind of militarized society, it didn't work. So one after another, these generals failed to provide stability. They failed to stabilize the economy, to stabilize the political order. So one after another, they were overthrown after failing in every way. This presented an opportunity for an enterprising person wishing to get into the empire business. Such a person was King Philip II of Macedonia. Born in 382 BC, reigned from 359 BC to 336 BC, and he was the father of Alexander the Great. Philip was not born to be king. His older brother, Perdiccas III, reigned as king of Macedon for 5 years, from 365 to 360 BC. Perdiccas died, along with 4,000 of his troops, in a misbegotten invasion of Dardania. And that was the old Greek name for what was northwest of Macedon. So that's, on today's maps, that's Serbia, Kosovo, and eastern Albania. Perdiccas left an infant son as king of Macedonia. So, you know what's going to happen. Do it. Need I say it? Well, okay. This arrangement lasted several minutes until Philip asserted control in a state of emergency. He made a treaty with the Dardanian king, Bardalis, solemnized by marrying Bardalis' niece, Audata. She was the first of Philip's 7 wives. And she's not Alexander's mother. His mother was another wife. And then Philip obtained recognition of himself as king of Macedon. He then made careful preparations, because he had no intention at all of keeping his word to Bardalis. And after the preparations were made, Philip broke the treaty by invading Dardania. He avenged the earlier loss and death of Perdiccas by killing 7,000 Dardanians in battle in 357 BC, effectively neutralizing them as a military threat. Philip then captured and fortified towns between Macedonia and Dardania, creating a buffer zone. Among the towns that Philip stole for this objective was the town of Crenades, between 2 rivers, at the foot of Mount Pengaion. In addition to this felicitous, well-hydrated location, Crenades, the citizens of Crenades, discovered and excavated a gold mine, which inspired Philip to rename the town after himself. I mention this because this town, renamed town of Philippi, is the same Philippi that St. Paul visited in the Acts of the Apostles, and to which he addressed his letter to the Philippians. One of Philip's bodyguards stabbed him to death in October of 336 BC at a theater where everyone who mattered in Macedonia was gathered to pretend to celebrate. Well, not they had to perform at a celebration of a wedding of Alexander's sister. Now, the assassin was speared to death before he could explain his motive. Now, there are some stories about the motive that have survived. Well, since this is a family-friendly channel, I will skip those. Just leave it at that. Philip was murdered. Philip, of his 7 wives, wife number 4, was named Olympias from Epirus, and with her he had Alexander. Alexander took the family conquest business international. He completed the conquest of Greece, and before departing on his adventures to conquer the world, Alexander had the corpse of his father's assassin executed by crucifixion for the crime of regicide. So King Alexander III, Alexander the Great, expanded the Macedonian Empire in all directions by means of conquest. And that is one of the great epics of history. But we can't go through all the battles because that would take too much time. But so we'll cover the effects of what he did, which does directly impact the New Testament as well as the patristic period. By the time of Alexander's death in 323 BC, this empire stretched 3,000 miles of latitude, from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east. Invariably, imposition of political unity onto diverse cultures fostered synthesis of ideas and syncretism in practices, combining elements from many into a new whole, a new alignment. Alexander's unified realm brought into communication and synthesis concepts that we've covered for the previous through the previous sessions: Hindu reincarnation, Zoroastrian dualism, Babylonian astrology, which included fatalism, the concept of fate, Greek philosophy, along with the specific pantheons of all the subject areas. In addition to the natural cultural exchanges fostered by trade and political unity, Alexander actively promoted syncretism. In the East, he wore the clothing of Eastern rulers, and he hosted a famous intermarriage ceremony for 1,000 couples at Smyrna, the city where St. Polycarp later was born. This not only is 1,000 couples getting married, that alone was striking, but he stipulated that one member of the couple had to be Greek or Macedonian, and the other member of the couple had to be non-Greek and non-Macedonian. For his own wife, he took Roxana, and she was ethnically, she was from Sogdiana, as they called it then. He conquered Persia, and one of the Persian provinces was Sogdiana. And on today's maps, that's Uzbekistan. So his wife, Roxana, was Uzbek. Now, why did he do this? Well, he had a philosophy behind this. He wanted to intentionally promote synthesis and syncretism for the purpose of creating a single world culture. No one else had tried that before. Now, this deliberate multiculturalism for the purpose of creating a monoculture, a synthesized monoculture, that far outlived him and far outlived the political entity of his empire. And so it's not called the Alexandrian Age after, because it existed centuries after he died. Instead, it's called the Hellenistic age. Remember, the Greeks did not call themselves Greeks; they called themselves Hellenes. So the Hellenistic, that comes from a Greek verb, hellezein, which means to speak Greek. That was part of his intent for the world culture, was that everybody speak the same language, speak Greek. And he was giving up something too, because he was not Greek. Alexander himself was not Greek. He was Macedonian, which is a different language and a different culture. So he was not trying to make everyone speak Macedonian. It was Greek. He saw that as a higher culture than his own, and thought that would be a better basis for unity. An essential consequence of this, for us to understand the patristic period and the New Testament period, is that for the next 600 years, the language of intellectual discourse and diplomacy was Attic Greek. That's the Ionian dialect, named for Attica, which is the region of Greece containing Athens. A simplified Greek called Koine Greek, or Common Greek, became the universal language for trade, and later the language of the New Testament. There are only a couple of parts of the New Testament that are in Classical Greek, Attic Greek, the letter to the Hebrews and the prologue to the Gospel of Luke. The only ones offhand that I can think of that are actually in Classical Greek. The rest is in Koine Greek. In the course of his travels and his conquest, Alexander established 30 new cities in his newly conquered territories to serve as bases, cultural colonies from which would spread this new Hellenistic culture. In a tribute to Macedonian modesty, he named all 30 of those cities after himself. The most famous of them, the most famous Alexandria, is the one in Egypt. He laid out the footprint for it in 332 BC. Let's see. No, I don't have. I don't know. So if you imagine the delta of the Nile River, well, here while we have it. So here's Greece and the Aegean and present-day Turkey on the other side, which is Ionia. So the Ionia is here, so like the cities of Ephesus and all on that side. And I can't find them. Just missed it. Yeah, okay. So here, you see the Nile, the delta of the Nile River, up in Egypt. So Alexandria is on one side. Imagine that the delta is shaped like a V. So on the western side, the upper western corner, is where Alexandria was established. Yeah, it's still there. See, it's on the. It's right there. It was a port city, and as all port cities, it became very wealthy. St. Mark, the evangelist, St. Mark, brought Christianity to Alexandria, and he experienced martyrdom for his fidelity there in the city. The first doctor of the church, St. Athanasius, was from that city, as well as St. Clement of Alexandria, who's a very important historical source for the patristic period. In terms of tracking down St. Peter's life after the New Testament, St. Cyril of Alexandria, and many others, fathers of the church. Okay, Alexander the Great died on the 11th of June, 323, at the age of 32, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in present-day Iraq. His wife, Roxana of Sogdiana, was pregnant at the time with the future Alexander IV. So the lack of an adult heir Now, okay, yeah, need I say it? What are the chances, of this enduring? Well, hopefully you've heard enough of my lectures to know that there was zero possibility of that enduring, and so that lack of an adult heir doomed the empire to a 47-year-long nightmare, conventionally enumerated into 4 wars of the successors, the Diadochi, from 322 to 275 BC. Amid the conflicts, in 309 BC, Roxana and Alexander IV were murdered, to the surprise of no one. During the conflicts, Alexander's empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms that proved to be easy prey for the Roman Empire, to the dismay of everyone. When Alexander died, Egypt fell initially to Cleomenes. In 305 BC, another of Alexander's generals, named Ptolemy, murdered Cleomenes and made himself pharaoh of Egypt. Now, this was the Ptolemy is spelled Ptolemy. This is Ptolemy the First. He imposed the dynasty, named for himself, of course, the Ptolemaic dynasty, that ruled Egypt for 275 years, until Egypt was absorbed by Rome in 30 BC. And for those fans of Egyptian history, this is the 32nd dynasty in Egyptian history. It ended, as we all know from Shakespeare, with the suicide of Cleopatra VII in 30 BC. Or think of Elizabeth Taylor, if you saw, depending on your age, if you've seen the movie, where Elizabeth Taylor plays Cleopatra, and Richard Burton plays Mark Antony. She, on the set, that'll just too far afield, but there's a lot of stories about that. Anyway, so the ruling class of Alexandria consisted of ethnically Macedonian and Greek pagans who imported with them Greek mythology, Greek philosophy, and the Greek language. They ruled over an indigenous population of Egypt, the Fellahin, who descended from one of the proto-civilizations of history. I mean, after the Ice Age, they were there. And they had their own 3 millennia-old mythology, which featured prominent examples of hybrid deities. These were human-animal hybrids, such as Anubis, who had the head of a jackal with the body of a man, or Horus, who had the head of a hawk and the body of a man. The interaction of these 2 cultures, the Greek and the Egyptian, resulted in a new cycle of synthesis and syncretism, cultural and religious blending. In terms of popular religion, the Greek Ptolemies invented a whole new deity named Serapis. It represented a combination of the Egyptian god of the dead, Osiris, with the Apis bull, which was sacred to the Egyptians, but with which the Greeks could identify because the bull was also sacred to their god Zeus. The Old Testament book of Sirach was written in Jerusalem, but translated into Greek by his grandson. That grandson moved to Egypt during the reign of Ptolemy VII, and he translated it in Alexandria. Motivated by concern, Sirach was, and his grandson, shared the concern, which is why I translated the work. Motivated by concern that Jewish youth, the most promising of the Jewish youth, were becoming so enamored of Hellenistic culture that they were abandoning their own traditions. without taking the trouble to understand them, what they were giving up. So that the book of Sirach, that's why it was written the way it was. It's like the Cliff Notes of the rest of the Old Testament. The first part is a summary of the best of Jewish wisdom tradition, and the second part is a useful historical review of some of the major figures of the Old Testament. In terms of popular philosophy, the hybrid nature of Egyptian culture, along with the Hellenistic impulse to deliberately foster cultural amalgamation, resulted in a new category of thought, articulated in a new genre of writing called allegory. That's derived from the Greek word allegorikos, which in turn is an elision of two Greek words. The prefix allos means another or different, like the alloy is a combination of different metals. The suffix agorein means to speak in the agora, or an agora is a public place, so to speak in the public place. So the colloquial use of this Greek word means to speak of more than one topic at the same time, to tell multiple stories at the same time. That's what an allegory is. So an allegory is a story with an underlying meaning. An allegorical interpretation is a method of analyzing something, a play, an essay, a story, a myth, a piece of writing, and analyzing it by intentionally looking for multiple meanings. Additionally, why I mention that is because the Catechism still includes allegory as one of the permitted methods for interpreting Scripture. In Numbers 115 through 118. Now, allegory, it also, in further down in 128, Catechism 128, allegory should not be confused with typology, which is a method of analyzing the Old Testament, intentionally looking for prefigurations of Jesus. So it's a more specific, typology is more specific than allegory. But allegory, it is permitted for us to read the Bible and looking for multiple layers of meaning. Additionally, Alexandrian wealth fostered scholarship, another leisure class, people who had the time to do that, to devote themselves to that. In the northeastern quarter of the city, a pupil of Aristotle, former pupil of Aristotle named Demetrius of Phaleron, convinced Ptolemy I to build a temple to the Greek Muses. So in Greek mythology, the Muses were the offspring of Zeus and Mnemosyne. Memory. So Mnemosyne was memory, the goddess of memory. So Zeus is power, and she's memory. And together they produced the daughters, the Muses, who each one was the goddess of a particular art form. So the union of power and memory produces the arts. And they all have, I can remember them all, Calliope, Clio, Melpomene, Terpsichore, anyway, they go on. But like Calliope is the muse of epic poetry. Clio is the muse of history. There's one for the dance. There's one for romantic poetry. There's one for drama. It goes on like that. So a temple to the muses, a temple to the arts, you actually know the name, is a museum. Temple to the Muses is a museum. So he built, Demetrius of Phaleron convinced Ptolemy to pay him to build a temple to the Muses as a center for scholarly pursuit and to promote Greek culture. Attached to this museum was a large library. You need that to pursue that. Within easy walking distance of the museum was the much larger Royal Library of Alexandria, which housed, we are told, 600,000 volumes of antiquities corpus of learning. Jews settled in Alexandria at the invitation of Ptolemy I in 305 BC. At the time, the city was divided into 5 quarters, each designated by a letter of the Greek alphabet. The first Jewish settlers were allowed to live in Quarter Delta, separately in its eastern section near the sea, in order to more conveniently observe the requirements of the Torah. Ptolemy and his successors permitted Alexandrian Jews to exist in a self-governing community, led by an ethnarch and a council of 71 elders, responsible for the tax theft. Obviously Ptolemy, wanted money, and that's accomplished through tax theft. But he let them collect it and transport it to him. And they were responsible for keeping order. Like any disputes among the Jews, like if they had a litigation, then they would be allowed to decide themselves. It would only be if a dispute between one of the Jews and then one of the Greeks or one of the Egyptians that the royal bureaucracy would get involved. On the whole, the Alexandrian Jews enjoyed very cordial relations with everyone else. It was only interrupted a couple of times, and that was not for ethnic or religious reasons. It was because of succession disputes. And the Jews, along with everybody else, got caught in the middle. This community produced many scholars, including Philo Judaeus, whom we will meet in due course. It became a center of Hellenistic, meaning Greek-speaking Judaism. Another of Alexander's successors, in addition to Cleomenes and Ptolemy, was named Seleucus. Seleucus. Born 358, reigned 321 through 281 BC. When Alexander was alive, he was commander of the Silver Shields, an elite unit in the army. By the time of the Fourth Diadochi War, which ended in 301 BC, Seleucus controlled the lands that are today Syria, Lebanon, the Holy Land, Jordan, and Iraq. On the 22nd of May, 300 BC, Seleucus celebrated by selecting the site for a new city, piously named Antioch, after his father, Antiochus. The location was at the edge of a large fertile plain between Mount Silipius and the left bank of the Orontes River, 15 miles inland from the Mediterranean. The Orontes River, in other words, it's a port. It's not actually on the coast, but the river was deep enough to handle the shipping. So even though it's inland, it was like New Orleans for that. I mean, New Orleans is not actually on the coast, but it is a port because it has a river that can handle the ships. Seleucus hired another former student of Aristotle, a guy named Xenarius, to design the city as a 4-mile grid. That's a very Aristotelian thing to do, lay out a grid, very logical, a grid shape. What's the name of it? It has a name. The grid, anyway, it's a grid shape. Seleucus settled 5,300 Athenian Greeks, along with his own Macedonian veterans, and he welcomed 25,000 Jewish and Arab settlers in order to promote trade. The lure, it was in 2 parts. First, he would grant them citizenship if they got in on the ground floor, so to speak, meaning they could own property in the city. And the second lure was the location. This is a port, so it would be incorporated into the caravan routes, and so the overland caravans. That was a place so they could unload and trade for goods that were coming in by sea, and vice versa. By the New Testament period, Antioch had flourished. It was very wealthy. So it was the third largest city in the Roman Empire in the New Testament period. So Rome was the biggest, then Alexandria, which we've already visited, and the third was Antioch. It had a population of 500,000. It had expanded into a tetrapolis. It was 4 cities. Antioch itself, Seleucia, Apamea, and Laodicea. Maintaining the familial theme, these were all named for relatives. So Apamea was named for Seleucus's wife. Laodicea named for his mother. Antioch, we've seen, was already named for his father, and Seleucia, modestly, was named for himself. Evidently, he found this hobby rewarding, as in his empire he established 16 Antiochs, 9 Seleucias, 6 Laodiceas, and 3 Apameas. Ptolemy Carrollton, who was the son of Ptolemy I, abruptly halted this indulgent pastime of founding cities and naming them after himself and his relatives. Carrollton ended it by stabbing Seleucus to death in 281 BC. In terms of the New Testament, Antioch was the place where followers of Christ were first called Christian. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 11, verse 26. Moreover, the third Christian bishop of Antioch, St. Ignatius of Antioch, coined the term Catholic Church. In a letter he wrote, this is his letter to the Smyrna, to the church in Smyrna, quote, "Wherever the bishop appears, let the people be there, just as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." Catholicae Ecclesia, the universal church. He's the first one. So from Antioch we get the term Christian and the term Catholic. The 2 Old Testament books of Maccabees recount a 40-year struggle of Jewish monotheism against attempts by later Seleucid overlords to forcibly Hellenize the Holy Land, meaning to forcibly impose uniform worship of pagan Greek religion, not just the Greek language, but worship of the pagan religion. So the struggle became violent under the 8th Seleucid king, named Antiochus IV. He reigned from 175 to 164 BC. In the year 167, he installed the cult of the Greek god Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. So obviously that's the Jews, that they rose up. Then a civil war started. Well, not a civil war. I suppose it would be civil war from Antiochus' perspective, but from the Jews' perspective, it was a war of emancipation, a war of liberation. After decades, literally 4 decades of struggle, Judea achieved political independence from the Seleucid Empire. Beginning in 135 BC, the descendants of the Maccabean leaders, that's named for the first leader, Judas Maccabeus, that means the hammer. So Judas was the first, he and his brothers, and they led the war of emancipation. So their descendants governed Judea as the Hasmonean dynasty, named for Judas Maccabeus' grandfather, Asmoneus, who was the father of Mattathias, who was martyred in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, and Mattathias was the father of Judas, the hammer. In a supreme irony, painful, crushing, spiritually crushing irony, the Hasmonean dynasty, which was created in opposition to Hellenistic paganizing of the Holy Land, would, after victory in peacetime drift mindlessly into Hellenism. The consequent departure from the Mosaic law among many of the population prompted faithful Jews who realized what was going on to promote a revival of study of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. That's the Tanakh, what we would call the Old Testament. They took as their inspiration Ezra, who we alluded to earlier in the last presentation. After the return from the Babylonian captivity, Ezra required Jews who had intermarried with non-Jews to abandon their spouses, as well as the children of those unions, as unclean. This is, you can read the details in the book of Ezra, chapter 7 and chapter 10, as well as in the book of Nehemiah, chapters 8 and 9. So these purists perceived Hellenism correctly as a threat to covenant fidelity, because it's the same problem that we saw, from the beginning throughout the Old Testament. It's encroachments of paganism. To insulate themselves from Hellenistic influence, these people who were pursuing this purification consciously adhered to every detail of the Mosaic law and deliberately kept themselves separated from the surrounding culture. This mode of life gave them their names: the separated ones, or the Pharisees. That was not the only response. I mean, that was one way. They were not the only ones who perceived it. That was their response, but they were not. There was another response among others who perceived it. A more spiritually radical response to the temptations of Hellenism, meaning paganism, was the development of a Jewish monastic movement, in which they literally fled to the desert to create communities, faithful communities, living on the Dead Sea, figuring that nobody else would want it, so they'd be left alone, because that's all they wanted, was just to be left alone. The extreme asceticism they practiced gave them their name, the pious ones, or the Hasid, that became the Essenes, the Jewish monastics, and of course that influenced the development of Christian monasticism. Okay, we'll leave them. Now back to the Greeks. During and after the humiliating loss of its political independence to Alexander and his successors, Greece took refuge in nostalgia, promoted in epics, dramas, poetry, and even their philosophy. One philosophical answer to coping with the depressing reality they lived in, recognizing it for what it was an ugly, self-inflicted subordination. So one philosophical response was articulated by Epicurus, Epicurus. He was born on the island of Samos in the Aegean around the year 341 BC, died 270 BC. So he lived through the conquest of Greece by the Macedonians. In his philosophical response, he pretended as if the Socratic movement never happened. And instead, he went back pre-Socrates, to the earlier atomic view of Democritus of Abdera. I don't think I spelled that in his name when I covered him earlier. So this is Democritus. So he revived the atomic view, which means a philosophical atheism. In his view, Epicurus saw the human person as nothing more than a collection of atoms that would decompose at death and reconstitute into something else. with that as a foundation for one's perspective on existence, belief in objective value to anything, including human life, was absurd. He concluded that the world was dangerous and people were, for the most part, insane and best avoided as much as possible. The ideal to pursue for an Epicurean was designated with the Greek word ataraxia, meaning freedom from agitation. That was the ideal to be pursued, to be free of agitation. How does one do that? Well, by maximizing personal pleasure and minimizing personal pain. So this, the Greek word for pleasure was hedone. It rendered in English as hedone. So obviously that's the word, hedonism. That's where that comes from. Therefore, in Epicurus, the Ionian intellectual awakening that we saw beginning with Thales had spiraled down into atheism and personal gratification. Now, in his defense, Epicurus, the father of hedonism, was not really a hedonist in the way that we use that term today. So the distinction, while he did believe in maximizing personal pleasure, minimizing personal pain, the difference is in what he defined as pleasure. So, for example, overindulgence in a pleasure could result in pain. So he preferred moderate exercise of pleasure. Because if you overindulge in pleasure, that causes you pain, then for a time you cannot experience pleasure. So far better for him to do moderate indulgence in pleasure, but then one can do it all the time because you won't get sick or worn out. So to put it in a more earthy example, so Epicurus and Epicureans would prefer to savor a single glass of the finest wine, whereas the hedonist, who takes that philosophy, maximizing personal pleasure, to without limits, without order, without reason, they would guzzle an entire keg of beer, make themselves sick for days, and then actually inflict pain on themselves. And then during that, they'd be too sick to really enjoy any other kind of pleasure. So that's the distinction between Epicureanism and hedonism, although there is obviously an underlying connection. Okay, a younger contemporary of Epicurus rejected such self-centered atheism. His name was Zeno of Citium. That's Zeno. And Citium was a city on the island of Cyprus. Citium. His life dates 335 to 263 BC. He worked out his response to philosophical despair on the island of Cyprus, his home, and then he brought it to Athens in the year 313 BC, which is why he was remembered. So that's 22 years after the death of Aristotle. He brought this to Athens. His philosophy is not called Zenoism. It's called Stoicism. Stoicism. Named for the Stoa Poikale, which is a Greek term for painted colonnade, in which Zeno gave his lectures. So, like Aristotle, Zeno was not a citizen of Athens, so he could not purchase property like Plato had done. So he had to use a public colonnade. And the one there's a painted colonnade and an unpainted colonnade. So he used the painted one. And so that's where he taught. And he got a number of students, so it became well known. So what Zeno taught in the painted colonnade was Stoicism. In his philosophy, he looked for inspiration to the period before Alexander and took the Socratic movement as his inspiration for establishing principles of certainty and understanding the universe and to construct a way to live in the world, morality. So it's nostalgia, he might have been. But Zeno could not entirely escape his milieu of Hellenistic syncretism. So we find elements from that larger cultural movement in his specific philosophical assertions. From the Zoroastrians, Zeno took the belief that the material universe was constructed from fire. That was the base element. From Babylonian astrology, Zeno appropriated belief in fate, fatalism, meaning that the individual cannot alter the unfolding of the world. There's no point in trying. One can only make a choice to act or not to act, and in what manner one will act or not act. So even not acting, I mean, that is so. But how are you not going to? Are you just going to sit down at the crossroads and do nothing, or are you going to run away? How are you not going to act or act? So that we can do. From Aristotle, Zeno appropriated belief that the human person learns through experience, empirically. Early Stoicism was therefore very interested in what we would call science, as was Aristotle. I mean, natural philosophy, nature, and understanding the laws by which nature operated. Together, these beliefs provided the foundation for Stoic ethics, starting with an ontological principle. Ontology is the philosophy of being and existence. So their foundational principle is that creation operates according to logical rules, laws of nature, or the natural law. Those rules are beyond the power of any individual to control. That being the case, happiness is achieved by living in accord with the natural law and in controlling the small part of creation that the natural law grants us the power to control. Specifically, our responses to the unfolding of creation. So that's happiness. Unhappiness is derived from living contrary to the natural law, attempting to control that which is by nature beyond our control, or living in a way that is harmful to one's health, safety, or community order. For the Stoic, the superior person, or I would say the superior, but the goal. I mean, like for Epicurus, it was ataraxia, freedom from agitation. For the Stoic, the goal was to be the unmoved, to be unmoved. So, meaning that a Stoic was able to, because of the discipline, the mental discipline, and the correct perspective on the natural law, a Stoic would be one who would perform right action, whether in conditions of prosperity or adversity, whether in joy or sorrow. So in Greek Stoicism, the word used is apatheia, which means without passion. So one does right or wrong without passion. You just do the right act, regardless of how you feel, but your feelings are irrelevant with it. So you do it without passion because it is right, not because it feels good to do it or because it feels bad to do it. That's not even a consideration. Is it the right act? Then you do it. In Latin Stoicism, this virtue was described with the term equanimity, meaning the even spirit. The Stoic who achieved this level of awareness would, in Zeno's view, be immune to misfortune. Now, not that misfortune would not occur, of course, because that happens. People get sick, we all die. Wars happen, fires, all the famine. And so not that those things would not occur, but that the Stoic would understand that happiness is not at all connected with that happiness is internal, is the internal decision to live in accord with the natural law, whatever one's circumstances might be. Extrapolating from that, Zeno, concluded that only the Stoic is truly free. All others are slaves to disordered passions, defined as emotion invested in that which is beyond our control. And then compounded when one does invest emotion in that which is beyond our control and try to control it, and then it doesn't work out, the opposite of what we wanted happened. Then investing emotion in that feeling of frustration and anger, because we could not control something which by nature we should not attempt to control. Okay. A contemporary of both Epicurus and Zeno took his inspiration from Epicurus, yet formulated a different response that would alter the development of Platonism. So this response, another reason Aristotle, he didn't like the direction of the academy, so Plato's academy ended up teaching things that were really not consistent with Plato, and by the end were actually completely opposite of Plato. His name, this guy, was named Pyrrho, Pyrrho. I've also seen it spelled with an N at the end, Pyrrhon. He was from Elis, E-L-I-S. Life dates 365 through 275 BC. Born 2 generations after Athens was humiliated by Sparta. He lived through the conquest of Greece by Philip of Macedonia and the demotion of Greece to being merely one province among many in Alexander's empire. Out of disgust, he reacted by going to the opposite extreme of concluding that the entire Socratic movement of attempting to find certainty was doomed before it ever began, because there is no certainty. Certainty does not exist. They were looking for that which does not exist. They were looking for the unicorn. But he didn't phrase it that way. He was looking for something that did not exist. So for Pyrrho, there is no true or false. Opinions, inclinations, senses, reasoning, none of that is true or false. Certainty does not exist. Certainty was merely a philosophical construct from a man who committed suicide, Socrates, seeking to create order and a higher meaning where in fact none existed. Pyrrho's solution was the principle of non-assertion. If one never asserts truth or falsehood, if one never asserts that this is right and that is wrong, then one can exist with tranquility of mind. So this is his way of getting to Epicurean ataraxia, freedom from agitation. But it's further, it's a step farther from Epicurus, so it's a different word is used. This is described with the Greek word epoche, meaning cessation, to cease, which is an intellectually induced state in which we neither affirm or deny anything. The justification for this posture, Pyrrho reasoned, is that all pragmata, that pragmata means any matters of the world, any affairs, any questions of right or wrong, any topics of consideration, is this a worthy piece of literature or not, Is this endeavor, is building this bridge, is that worth doing? Now, all of those pragmata are, he described with the word adiaphora. They are adiaphora, which means not differentiable. Not different or differentiable, meaning they cannot be differentiated into right or wrong, good or bad, worthy or unworthy. And that includes the principle of non-assertion itself. So he would tell even his disciples, like, don't argue to convince people of the principle of non-assertion. That one can merely state, this is my belief based on observation, and then it's up to you. You do what you want. So this is like the whatever philosophy. You see the kids say that today. So what did you think of that? Oh, whatever. Whatever. No, it has another name, of course. The prevailing situation in Greece, the humiliation, that all of those things we covered, had turned the thoughts of many in a similar direction. Like he put words to internal sentiments of frustration and shame and degradation that many felt. So it was persuasive to a sufficient number of people that Pyrrhon is considered the father of a whole school of thought, philosophical skepticism. St. Paul encountered skepticism along with Epicureanism and Stoicism during his second missionary journey to the city of Athens around the year 52-53 AD. After Alexander, and of course all three of these are going to impact the fathers of the church, and they're going to have to respond to all of this. And I mean, as late as Augustine, he wrote against what they were calling them the academics, because Plato's academy had been completely suborned by Pyrrho and his descendants. So when Augustine wrote against the academics, in his day, that was the skeptics. He was writing against skepticism. Okay, back to Rome. After Alexander's death and the disintegration of his empire in the Diadochi Wars, and the Rome was ideally poised to pick up the pieces and absorb them into its own Roman Empire. And this was all done in the period, well, not all, but most of it, 3/4 of the Roman Empire was actually assembled when Rome was technically a republic. So we last visited Rome on the occasion of its monarchy drowning in a bloodbath of assassinations and civil war, succeeded by a new political construct, the Republic, which existed from 509 BC to 27 AD, boasting annually elected magistrates, supervised by hereditary plutocrats in the Senate. During this period, the lure of conquest proved irresistible, as additional wealth flowed in with each new acquisition of land, water sources, trade routes, looted treasuries, gold mines, silver mines, tin mines, copper mines, and enslaved populations. Once the peninsula of Italy was absorbed, Rome, and then Rome expanded, then Rome bumped into and became rivals with the Phoenicians for control of the Mediterranean, whom we've already met. Specifically, the Phoenicians Rome came into conflict with, most famously, was the Phoenician colony of Carthage on the northwest coast of Africa. The first three Punic Wars, Rome fought three major wars against Carthage, and they're called in Roman history the Punic Wars. So that is from the Latin word punicus, is their word for Carthaginian, because Carthage was a Phoenician colony. And the Greek word for the shellfish, when I first introduced the Phoenicians, I talked about there's a shellfish that can be turned into purple dye. So the Greek word for that is the phoenix. So the Phoenicians. And then, so since the Phoenicians founded Carthage, then that became, from the Phoenix, then the Latin contraction of that was the Punicius, and then that became Punic. So the three wars against Carthage began in 264 BC. The first one ended with Roman victory and possession of the island of Sicily in 241 BC. The Second Punic War, that's the one with Hannibal, began in 218 BC, ending in 201 BC with Roman victory and possession of Spain and the southern coast of France and the Italian Riviera. The Third Punic War, that's Cato the Elder, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, began in 149 BC and ended in 146 BC with the erasure of Carthage, the extermination of Carthage. Literally, they destroyed the city. It was abandoned. The site was abandoned. And that ended with the Roman possession of northwestern coast of Africa. Overlapping that century of conflict against Carthage, Roman expansion continued elsewhere, east and west. The legions conquered Greece by 197 BC. Rome conquered Syria, Lebanon, and the Holy Land by 63 BC, which we'll discuss shortly. It conquered present-day France and much of western continental Europe, west of the Rhine River, by 51 BC. Egypt by 47 BC. So that when the incarnation of Christ occurred, Rome controlled the entire perimeter, the entire coastlands of the Mediterranean Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Aegean Sea, along with the western and southern coast of the Black Sea, all the way west to the Atlantic Ocean. The legions that made these conquests consisted of professional soldiers spending years away from Italy and paid by their general with wealth stolen from invaded territories or generated through the sale of the population into slavery. So that's a mistake that our founding fathers learned from. So our military is paid by the treasury, whereas in Rome there wasn't. It was paid by the general. Therefore, the troops invested their loyalty in their general rather than the Senate, and their identity was with the legion rather than with Rome. Because of this dynamic, the Republic could not indefinitely coexist with imperialism. The Republic, like the monarchy before it, was butchered to death internally by civil wars, which lasted the entire last century of its existence. In those civil wars, the legions were pitted against each other, seeking to place their own general in de facto control of the Republic. Okay, we'll pause there because next we're going to go into, they're all coming together now. So now we've seen how Greece is now absorbed by Rome, and next the Holy Land will be absorbed by Rome, and that's what we'll move into next. So that'll bring the three cultures together that we've been covering separately, the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman. So we have the Roman and the Greek together, and next is going to be how those absorb the Holy Land, and then we just go into the New Testament period and the period of the fathers of the church. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.